Tonight, the Cold War built a nuclear engine so dangerous it never had to fly to become a warning. Project Pluto was real, and the reason it stopped is worse than failure. For decades, a terrifying rumor circulated through the most secretive corridors of the Cold War. The legend claimed the American military designed a massive doomsday machine to patrol the Soviet border. This impossible weapon did not simply carry a nuclear warhead to a distant target, it was powered entirely by an unshielded nuclear reactor. Wherever this silent machine flew, it would continuously rain lethal, radioactive fallout upon the Earth below. Its acoustic shockwave alone was rumored to be powerful enough to completely flatten suburban neighborhoods. It was designed to be unstoppable, unreachable, and entirely devoid of any human compassion or mercy. The military allegedly poured millions of dollars into developing this ultimate airborne weapon of mass destruction. Some conspiracy theorists argued that the government tested these radioactive craft over isolated civilian populations, a flying Chernobyl. The rumor sounded far too apocalyptic for any sane government to actually fund or construct. The idea of a weapon that destroys the world just by flying seemed like pure fiction. Okay, stop right there. That is not a weapon, it is a war crime with wings. And no, there was no secret fleet of ghost ships. The missile never flew. But the actual engine tests worked well enough to make this nightmare entirely practical. The very real and highly classified program was officially designated as Project Pluto. It began in the late 1950s as a joint venture between brilliant military minds. The United States Air Force partnered directly with the Atomic Energy Commission for this monumental task. They were desperately trying to solve a strategic problem that threatened the entire nuclear deterrent. The sudden emergence of highly sophisticated Soviet radar networks meant that traditional high-altitude bombers were becoming dangerously vulnerable to immediate interception before dropping their payloads. America desperately needed a weapon that could penetrate enemy airspace by flying extremely low. Treetop height. Flying low requires immense fuel consumption because the thicker atmosphere creates massive aerodynamic drag continually. Traditional chemical rockets would simply run out of fuel long before reaching their distant international targets. Contractors realized they needed an engine that did not rely on heavy tanks of jet fuel. The proposed solution was a terrifying concept called the Supersonic Low-Altitude Missile, or SLAM. Instead of carrying limited chemical propellants, the massive cruise missile would carry a nuclear reactor. The renowned Lawrence Radiation Laboratory in California was tasked with turning this science fiction into reality. The physics behind the nuclear ramjet engine were brutally elegant and horrifyingly simple in concept. At supersonic speeds, dense air would violently slam into the open front intake of the missile. That rushing atmosphere would compress and pass directly through the scorching channels of the nuclear core. The extreme nuclear heat would instantly expand the air and blast it out the rear exhaust. Infinite thrust. Because a nuclear reactor does not require stored oxygen to burn, the range was practically limitless. The massive drone could theoretically circle over the ocean for months while waiting for a command. Once ordered to attack, it would drop down to tree level and accelerate to Mach 3. The sheer acoustic shockwave of a locomotive-sized machine moving at 3 times the speed of sound at ground level would crush buildings and kill humans. And that brutal sonic destruction was only the byproduct of its actual approach toward the target. After launching multiple nuclear warheads, the empty missile would simply continue to fly over enemy territory. Its unshielded reactor would constantly spew lethal radioactive isotopes across the landscape until it finally crashed. It is brilliant engineering. But think about the reality of an unshielded reactor rocketing over the landscape. It is turning the atmosphere itself into radioactive exhaust. Even if you only fly it over enemy territory, you are permanently poisoning the Earth for generations. The brilliant engineers at the laboratory had to prove this nightmare could actually work mechanically. They designed prototype engines capable of withstanding unthinkable internal temperatures and extreme pressures. The delicate fuel elements were constructed from specialized ceramics rather than traditional aerospace metals. Standard steel would simply melt like water inside the scorching belly of this beast. Creating these unique ceramic tubes required entirely new manufacturing processes developed specifically for this dark purpose. Scientists worked tirelessly in guarded laboratories to perfect the exact chemical mixture required for the core. The first test reactor was named Tori 2A and mounted securely on an armored railroad car. They moved it into the desolate expanse of Jackass Flats deep inside the lonely Nevada desert. The sprawling test site required miles of heavy steel piping and enormous air storage tanks. In 1961, the engine roared to life and proved the nuclear ramjet concept completely viable. It functioned beautifully. The scientists had successfully captured the fire of a nuclear core inside an open metal cylinder. 3 years later, they built the Tori 2C, a lighter and vastly more powerful operational successor. During a full power test in 1964, it produced 500 megawatts of raw heat. The incredible thrust generated was absolutely staggering, perfectly matching the ambitious calculations of the original designers. The desert ground shook violently as the nuclear furnace inhaled compressed air and exhaled radioactive fury. This is where the story usually celebrates the triumph of human ingenuity against impossible odds. The scientists did exactly what they were asked to do. They solved the impossible math, but success brought them face to face with a question they could not safely answer. The technological triumph at Jackass Flats immediately created an insurmountable political and environmental testing nightmare. You cannot simply test a flying nuclear reactor in the sky over your own sovereign country. The radioactive wake would contaminate any American testing range and the civilian populations living downwind. Planners even considered crashing the highly radioactive prototypes into the deepest ocean trenches after flights. But every proposed testing solution only highlighted the absolute environmental lunacy of the entire weapons program. The missile was so profoundly dangerous that its own creators could not safely observe it fly. No politician wanted to authorize a weapon that functioned by constantly emitting a trail of poison. Intercontinental ballistic missiles were rapidly becoming faster, cheaper, and vastly cleaner to test from underground silos without raining continuous fallout over the entire northern hemisphere. The strategic necessity for a loitering doomsday cruise missile was evaporating alongside its political support. The paper trail points toward a colder realization. Some weapons are simply too ugly to deploy. The military doesn't usually cancel a weapon that works perfectly, but a weapon you can never test is a weapon you can never trust. And a weapon that destroys the world just by existing is much harder to defend in a congressional budget hearing. On July 1st, 1964, the Pentagon officially canceled Project Pluto without a single test flight. The machine died on paper. 7 years of brilliant atomic research were immediately dismantled and locked away in silent government archives. The massive Tori reactors were slowly disassembled, their radioactive components carefully buried deep within the desert. The vast infrastructure at Jackass Flats was completely abandoned to the scorching sun and relentless wind. The sudden cancellation was not a failure of American science or engineering capability at all. It was a rare historical moment where military ambition looked directly into the abyss and retreated. They recognized that building a weapon that continuously poisons the sky is an act of madness. The legacy of Project Pluto is not the technology it created, but the boundary it established. It forced human civilization to acknowledge that absolute destructive power comes with an unacceptable environmental cost. That is the nightmare version of success, not failure. Success. They built the thing well enough that the safest option was to stop pretending it could ever be acceptable. We love stories about secret weapons that fail because they were built by fools. But Project Pluto did not fail. It was built by absolute geniuses. It was canceled because it was far too successful at being terrifying. Today, the Nevada test site remains completely silent under the harsh glare of the endless sun. The concrete bunkers and massive air compressors slowly rust away in the dry, blowing wind. Project Pluto stands as a physical monument to the absolute outer limits of Cold War paranoia. It proves that human beings can engineer a brutal solution to almost any problem we imagine. But it proves that we must be incredibly careful about the problems we choose to solve. Because sometimes, the math works. The radioactive ghosts of those unshielded reactors still linger heavily in the dust of Jackass Flats. They remind us that the distance between a brilliant idea and an apocalypse is very short. We survived the 20th century because we finally learned how to leave apocalyptic machines chained down. Project Pluto was not a failure. It was a successful machine that forced a moral retreat. The warning is not that humans can build apocalypse. It is that sometimes we can build it perfectly and still have to choose not to use it. Project Pluto is the nightmare version of success, a machine built well enough to terrify its own creators. Like, subscribe, and come back for the next MasonZero story through the past.